Welcome everyone to another session of 30 Minutes with a Modern Mystic. I'm Sascha, your host, and this is Micah Rhodes.
I am the modern mystic.
Yeah, we won't go into that again. And today's topic is spiritual teaching.
And it came about in a rather interesting way because Sascha said to me,
Sascha said to Michael that I feel an energetic flow and upliftment when I'm on the screen with him, when I'm having a conversation, or even not having a conversation, when we do these talks together, or when he's giving a course and I'm somehow taking part in it. And I told him that I had this with 2 or 3 other spiritual teachers in my life before. And I was just asking him how that works when you feel that upliftment of your chakras and you feel just an energetic buzz in general. And so we thought it might be interesting in general to talk about spiritual teachers. I came up with the word gurus as way maybe in that context. And then Michael said, let's talk about spiritual teaching.
So also sometimes in the remarks or the chat, when we've been doing creating, entering a new paradigm, I've noticed a number of people say, I just opened my heart up and let it in. And some have felt all their tension flows out. And a whole lot of number of people have said that the positive things that happen to them simply by just connecting rather than listening to every word. Yeah. Or putting it all together and coming to a conclusion.
And also observing, I think, mostly women, both in life-intensive courses and also during those online courses that you've been doing, are the ones that write comments like, so beautiful connecting with your energy, or very heartwarming to connect again, or, you know.
Yeah, and that is true. But on the other hand, you know, as I've often said, women have a higher frequency, and because they give birth, I think they're emotionally stronger. I think they need to be. I mean, we're not talking as a generalization. They're stronger emotionally and have a greater emotional vulnerability. And so, like we were talking about last night, when I sat on the laps of these big men and sang "I Love You." Yeah. I mean, I've had women cry, but I've never had anybody freak out like those men did on that, because we normally don't have that. So when we're in conversation, you and I, and we sit, and basically, even though it's an electronic medium, it doesn't get in the way. Like, I'm not sure if we actually make eye contact. I guess if I look at the little white light and don't look at your picture, I'm inclined to talk to the picture. But if I look at the little white light, it's interesting because, you know, in a way, in a metaphysical way, we're both sitting in the same room. We're both sitting in my room. We're both sitting in your room. We're both looking at each other and talking. And generally, it's very common when you have a spiritual teacher that you take away the psychic shields, the psychic blocks, or defense, or whatever you like to have it, and you become more vulnerable to a psychic teacher, to a spiritual teacher, even if you're not there to learn from them. There's a vulnerability. And I suspect that's what happens with you and I. And so the strength of my spiritual energy, we'll say, my spiritual certainty and clarity, when you get to know that spiritual teacher, it is very self-empowering, and it exudes a form. You feel self-confident. You feel, okay, I can trust this man or woman. I can relax. I can just let it in. Whereas in everyday life, people block because they want to protect themselves. And why? Because the subconscious is full of fear.
I'm just thinking right now, maybe one of the reasons why we're so influenced by our parents is that naturally we don't have, as children, we don't have these psychic shields towards our parents. So we absorb all of their energy into us.
And it's not always good.
Yeah, right. But maybe that is the reason that we don't have those shields towards our parents when we're born and the first couple of years. And
don't, and we can sometimes get badly hurt. And those people who do, often they're called unkindly control freaks because they've been hurt as a child and they're not going to let that happen as an adult. And so they definitely have blocks and shields and become sort of almost emotionless and while trying to look after themselves and everybody else.
Would you mind looking at these shields? Sorry, no, go ahead.
Sorry, what?
I was just saying, would you mind looking at this topic of shields for a second together? How we put these shields up, like, are they thought forms that then materialize into a form of like energetic blocks in our...
I feel a psychic shield is like it's because we're all psychic beings, we're spiritual beings, psychic. Most people don't develop that, but psychic shields are really a subconscious thing. And they've been with us, we've developed them over a vast period of time because we get hurt by so many people. Casual words, cruel words, the playground for children is a battleground. And so we grow up, we get hurt, but gradually we learn to block it. But we don't know we're learning to block it, but we gradually learn to block it. And that becomes a psychic shield. And we never realize we've done this so many times. And so we know the pathway to putting up a block. So we hear the words, but it no longer hits our emotional body. And we can feel angry, but we don't get impassionate and angry and aggressive, because I think, quite honestly, humanity, the way it is today, if we didn't have these psychic shields, there'd be murder on every street.
Also, I think some cultures are much stronger on psychic shields than others, right?
I would say so, but those cultures would appear to be more closed down. I've often used the example, the Italians, very open, they hug, they kiss, they scream out the windows of any car that cuts them off, screaming. You go to Japan and it's all tight and held back and reserved. And I'm not saying either side is wrong or right. I'm just saying that's how the cultures have come. And there's an enormous emotional suppression in Japan and Korean countries and many of those Asian countries, whereas Italy is just about the opposite. And a lot of Europe is what I'd call like us, more moderate, but the Italians are way out there on the one end and the Japanese on the other end. I say Japanese because I've been there every year for 18 years or more, so I got used to it. A lot of their stuff I really liked, but they seem to be very, like the Swiss, are a bit closed down and very protective. So if I smile at them, Karen and I walking along a footpath, and there's an ordinary couple coming toward us, they look away. It's like, you don't know us, why would you smile? Yeah. So they quickly look away, whereas children and elderly, they give you a nice smile. And in a way, it's all part of this self-defense. Let me defend myself. And so there are so many ways of doing it. And in the end, as you moving, if you're on your path toward enlightenment, you have to become vulnerable to humanity, to the world. You have to become vulnerable. And in the end, the paradox is that total vulnerability is literally total invulnerability.
Right. And so when you when you remove all those shields towards the spiritual teacher, or in the end towards anyone, then that's when real change starts to happen, right? That's when real spiritual development.
And do you know why? The change happens because when you block other people from coming in, you block yourself from moving out.
Yeah.
So you're therefore contained, like you're rather like a hermit crab in a shell.
You're rotting away.
Nothing can come in and get you because you just pull back in your shell, but you can't really get out. You're limited. A serious aggression will take you out of it, to hit somebody or shoot them, but otherwise you just stay in that shell. And so there's no freedom in that. And when you're talking enlightenment, spiritual enlightenment, you're talking freedom. And so when you're shut in, there's no freedom. And so it's a path that you eventually have to walk. I can remember when I was in that community I helped start, I was very aware that a lot of people didn't like me, and I've often told funny stories, but it wasn't funny for me. And I developed a sort of defense against them, and I often called it my suit of armor. And it was made up of arrogance, which really hid the 12-year-old boy who was terrified that somebody would find him in this 30-something body. And so I pretended arrogance, which was really fear in disguise. I always had articulation, and so I could take anybody to pieces with my articulation, and I would create an aggression. I would become aggressive. And that was a bit of an act. So was the arrogance, but I acted it well until it became part of me. And then one night I had a dream. And in this dream, it came to me very clearly. A being said, you have to take off your mask and your armor. And there was no question about it. And the next day I took it off. And I have never felt so vulnerable. And everybody knew I'd taken it off. It was like an energy thing had happened. Everybody knew. And I wouldn't say people lined up to give me a hard time, but there was no lack of volunteers. And people had always stood back away from me, came and told me what they didn't like about me and a whole lot of things. And I just allowed it. I just allowed it. I felt hurt. And there was one really bad situation. I don't know whether I should go into that.
No,
but that
okay.
was
That's
there was
okay.
one bad. There was one, I'll just say, one bad situation when drugs had got into the community, and I went, as chairman of the trust, I was responsible for to the police, and I was probably one of only a few people who didn't have any drugs. I never took them, and so I took on the whole community. Bang! We had a huge collision, and there was a meeting under the fig tree. And everybody in the community came there to tell me what they thought of me. And it's funny, I'd known for a long while that I would experience being reviled and hated. And I could never imagine the scenario where this would happen. Well, I found it. And for an hour and a half, seriously, a few men, mostly women, told me how much they hated me, and they came up with words that I'd never heard before. And I felt as though two hands had gone into my guts and were pulling out my whole intestinal area. I've never felt anything like it. And I let it go for an hour and a half. I said, enough. And I just drove off. I got in my vehicle and drove away. And I felt like vomiting when I got to where I was staying. I felt like vomiting. I didn't vomit. I had a shower and I felt a bit cleaner. And then I realized, just let go. And I had been completely vulnerable to them. And then I had to be vulnerable to myself, to not hold on to it, to not dialogue with it, not to analyze, but to just let it be. And as I managed to do that, something I'd never done before, as I managed to do that, it's as though it's like something pulled the plug out and I felt it draining away because I didn't try to somehow defend myself. You know, this is not fair because all the dialogue and the emotions, I just let it be and it drained away. And then I'm happy to say over the next several years, most of those women either emailed me or came to see me and apologized profusely. And they were stunned by how much hate had come up in them and what they'd said to me that they were aware I didn't really deserve. It's as though everybody was unloading the stress and the anger and the rage about this whole thing that had been going on with drugs.
So,
and for me, it was an incredible experience.
Since we set the topic of this session to spiritual teaching, maybe it's a good idea to come back to spiritual teaching, how this all connects with it.
I think talking about that spiritual teaching, I think if you really are going to be a spiritual teacher, okay, enlightenment helps it. But I think somehow I look back and I realize I had to experience such a thing, because before that, it would be the pure concept. And then I thought of people like Hitler, who had probably 50 million hating him. And then I thought of the soul that had played that role and the experience they had had. And I realized that if you're going to be a spiritual teacher, you've got to experience it rather than conceptualize it. And then you know what it is. Like I've been through pain and suffering and mental, emotional, and physical. And so when somebody's talking pain and suffering, I know exactly what it is on every level.
Okay.
And that, I didn't like the experiences, but I see the value and even the sacredness of them as I look back.
So we now know that being open, being vulnerable, taking that psychic shield or barrier down is an essential part of actually accepting a spiritual teaching or having a spiritual teacher or a real relationship with a spiritual teacher. What other things, or what would you say is the main component of a true spiritual teaching, or what makes a spiritual teaching a spiritual teaching?
I think really, I've heard a lot of spiritual teachers, a number of spiritual teachers gives talks, and Carolyn had a hand on my leg and a hand on my shoulder to hold me down, because I was completely shocked by the flippancy, by the lack of sincerity, by the inaccuracy, and all the stuff they were talking about, men and women. They meant well. I'll give them absolutely 100% on what they meant, but what they were saying was so off the mark and with such a flippancy. So I think that a spiritual teacher needs to always speak from experience, from a higher, a greater reality, rather than conceptualize. And so many people today have a good brain, their left brain is a good brain, they read it, they understand it, but they understand it intellectually. These spiritual teachers, many of them, and there are great ones, but there are many that understand it intellectually, but that's all it is. And that doesn't communicate really in a true way. And so if you've experienced it and you're talking about something and it's your experience, you can come from the heart, you're free, you're released, you can surrender to the moment, because you can't get it wrong, because it's your experience. And if you make that clear, then that was your experience. If it doesn't fit with somebody else, then as far as I'm concerned, you're not their teacher. There's plenty of people I'm not the teacher for, because I'm far too passionate. But for me, passion is the teacher. Love and passion within is the element of teaching that moves in as an energy and opens the heart and opens the mind and just moves in soul to soul. So spiritual teaching should definitely be soul to soul, not brain to brain or brain to heart. It should be heart to heart, soul to soul, love to love.
Does everybody require a spiritual teacher or even spiritual teachings? Or is it also possible to just live your life and through whatever you do, just experience, having insights? And
it's ironic, isn't it? I would never have had a spiritual teacher. I would never have followed anybody. I wouldn't listen to anybody else. I read books, but I listened to about 2 spiritual teachers when I was on my path. And the only reason I've heard them since is because I was at the same conference as a speaker, and I wanted to see how things are going. And so I personally think that a spiritual teacher who is, I have to say it, I do see a difference between an enlightened spiritual teacher, man or woman, than a non-enlightened, because the enlightened one is coming from a higher state of consciousness. Like it or lump it, that's the way it is, coming from a higher state of consciousness. And if there is openness in the student, then that is a tremendously powerful experience and happening. And a lot of people seek that. There are far too many false prophets now. and I'm not giving any names because they're completely irrelevant. There are many false prophets. Most of them are not very well known. There are many of those. But so what could I say? Because I would have shunned it, I can't say, yes, I think you should. So I think it depends entirely on the person. I was a reader and got a lot of spiritual information that I always had the wisdom to live it. And if it fell by the wayside, well, it wasn't for me. But if you're not a reader, and many people today are not, then I think a spiritual teacher, if once they get to you, teach you how to listen, a spiritual teacher has a really lot to offer. I used to once be against gurus. Long ago softened my approach to that, because I know for a fact that some of the gurus are wise, wonderful, and brilliant. Some of them should never have been allowed out of their cage. We'll leave it like that.
Would you agree that if we want to define spiritual teachings, what makes a teaching spiritual, that it's a teaching that broadens your consciousness as a very general definition?
I think a spiritual teacher who's teaching how to live on a daily basis, that is, to me, is the highest form of spiritual teaching. Talking high convoluted ideas of angels floating around and archangels coming to help us, lovely, but impractical. When you're in the kitchen and your husband's just hit you smack across the side of the face, and you're laying on the floor, or your wife has just hit you with the saucepan and you're laying on the floor, then in those moments, the angels and archangels aren't much good. In those moments, do you fly into a rage and retaliate and something really bad is happening, or do you simply pick yourself up and take yourself out of the room to not move into rage, and then to begin to think, what happened to that person that they took such action? What did I do to stimulate it? And not to deeply analyze it, but begin to look at it in a framework from the 2 points of view. Had you created this anger in this person, or was it there? And is it therefore I need to get out of their life? This marriage, this relationship is ended. That, to me, when you're taught how to do that, and yes, personal counseling can be of very great value, then you're sort of on your path to creating realities that work for you, responding to the moment rather than reacting. And reactions are generally fear-based, aggression and anger, and they lead to disaster, generally speaking.
Okay, so there is the practicality of it that is important.
I think so. I mean, that was a fairly strong one, but if somebody for no real reason criticizes you and then you react, that's you might have spiritual information, but you're not using it. So the spiritual student needs to realize that I must act. It is critical that I act on what I spiritually learn. And if I can't act on it, I haven't learned it. I have information. And the word is information, unformed, unrealized. So I think that is one of the greatest abilities that the spiritual student needs, to bring it into their life and act on it. If it lets them down, it wasn't their truth or their timing for that truth.
Would you agree if I said that spiritual teaching is any kind of teaching that helps you move towards a consciousness that encompasses you as a holistic metaphysical being more than just looking at your merely physical body?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yes, a spiritual teacher is moving you in a direction that is whole and loving and self-empowering and fulfilling. Because a lot of people achieve a lot, but how many, when they get into their mature years, are completely fulfilled in their life, in their moment, in their daily life?
Not so many.
Are completely fulfilled. Not so common.
Yep. Yeah, because when I get the question, what does it mean you're interested in spiritual teachings, or you like spiritual teachers, or you like readings? What does it actually mean? Like from someone purely materialistic, I would always say something general like it means to open up to the idea and widen your consciousness so that you understand that you're not just limited to this physical experience and body, but that you are actually much bigger. And that's what spirituality is, like just opening up
Yeah.
towards that.
Also, a spiritual teacher has to be sensitive to the student. They have to not give them the answers, but to teach the student to allow the student to find the questions. And when they found the questions, then the answers really aren't all that important. And so I've never taken on individual people, but I've noticed that I sort of help a lot of friends of mine, encourage them whether they want it or not. And but it's always I always do it in a way that is self-empowering for them rather than me giving them answers. And that's always felt pretty important to me,
How about
because I had to find my answers in me, not in another person.
And I think that leads beautifully to maybe the closing question of this session, which would be, how do we discern, or what's maybe a compass you could give people, how to best discern between different spiritual teachings? You know, you might read something, but maybe someone who's not as connected with their own intuition and doesn't feel where to follow, what to follow. What's the best guideline?
The spiritual teacher for you is the one that energetically reaches into your heart, and you get a sign, almost like a sigh, and you feel, oh, and that's the person for you. And they'll own you, their unique way. They touch you. They're the person for you. Some people lost in their left brain intellect don't get that experience. So they follow knowledge, spiritual knowledge. And that isn't wrong, but it's a longer path. But those who approach us or look around with an awareness of what a spiritual teacher can offer, they don't look for cleverness, they don't look for answers, they look for the one that touches them on a deep level, and they just sort of feel a wave of relaxation. This is the one. And who they are doesn't matter. That's the one that makes you feel you suddenly can relax. You can, basically the word is trust. You feel you can trust them. And today, trust is not the easiest thing. We're going to talk about that in that next hour I do, the one a month, the energy of trust. But when you feel, I can trust this person, that you've found your spiritual teacher.
Because basically you feel vulnerable enough with them to begin trusting yourself.
You could put it that way, but you've got to generally, yeah, everybody could write an essay on trust, but it's all intellectual. Very, very few people trust. Yeah. It's an interesting subject. I could do an hour on that quite easily. So that any spiritual teacher who engenders trust in them is engendering trust in themselves. And it's only when they feel they trust themselves that they can trust the spiritual teacher. Although to them, it doesn't appeal to that. It appears, I can trust this man or woman. But in fact, they've already been gifted. I can trust myself to trust this person. That's a great gift. And once you've got that, between two people, you've already made that connection that you were talking about at the very beginning of this little show.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for this session.
My pleasure.
And to everybody who's listening, I hope you've been enjoying our conversation. And make sure to share this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button, the like button, you know it, and see you in the next session.
See you then. Thank you.